domestic work in India. On the outset, I'd just like to say this webinar is being recorded. And before we begin, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Igor Bosch, who's the Chief Technical Advisor of the Work and Freedom Program, to tell us a little bit about the program and welcome the participants. Over to you, Igor.
Thank you very much, Neha. Very warm welcome to all of you. Also welcome to our panelists who are here with us today. Particularly, we have with us Dagmar Walters from our headquarters, who's a senior advisor for research. We have with us the authors of the reports we will be presenting. We have Dr. Gautam Ban, Associate Dean of the School of Human Development of the India Institute of Human Settlements. We also have his colleagues, Dr. Divya Ravindranath, Senior Consultant from the School of Human Development, Antara Rai Chowdhury as well, Rashi Mehra as well. I would also like to take this opportunity before we start to thank everyone who's participated in this report, who may not be among the panelists, but deserves to be mentioned. Also, particularly here, Divij Sinha, Amrut Kiran, Teja Maladi, Kinjal Sampat, and also a special mention for the Center for the Study of Development Societies for their support in organizing and training surveyors. And of course, for the support of training surveyors and field investigators as well. So with that, I would like to say a few words about this initiative today and the context of the Work and Freedom Program. We will be presenting these reports, which were produced as part of the Work and Freedom Program in a collaboration with the Institute of Human Settlements. And this is basically part of the Work and Freedom Program, which is a program meant to address vulnerability to forced labor and human trafficking. It's a development cooperation program of the ILO. It's been going on for the last 10 years, and it's almost coming to an end. We'll be closing in a few months, but we have supported and produced a significant amount of research, and also we have also implemented very interesting demonstrative activities and interventions in different countries. This program is based particularly in South Asia and in West Asia, so countries of India, Nepal, Bangladesh, as well as Kuwait, Lebanon, and Jordan. And the idea of the program has been to focus on basically women's work in the context of migration between and within South Asia and West Asia. So we're looking particularly at domestic work and garment work. And so because domestic work has been one of the prime topics of our work, we've always tried to find out a little more about, what we're doing when and with whom are we working when we talk about domestic work. And in the previous years, we had done some research on employers of domestic workers, particularly in Delhi and in Mumbai. Of course, there's also a lot of significant research that's already been done among domestic workers themselves, and the types of issues related to their working conditions. But the idea, which was still pending, was to understand what is sort of the threshold between when households go from relying on unpaid domestic work, so people within the family who are often basically working within the household, and when they start hiring work. And so what are the social economic characteristics, the geographical characteristics of this within the urban space? And this is very important because it allows them to zero in and understand exactly who we're talking about, where they are, and for all sorts of policy purposes, it is a unique tool to be able that can inform the work that the ILO and its constituents that do. So that was one of the main reasons why we decided to fund this, and we're very happy to have worked with Gautam and his team, who will be making this presentation. I think that by far, this research has surpassed all the expectations that at least in the Working Freedom team we've had. So I'm very happy that and honored to have this team with you, and also very happy that all of you have been able to register and attend to this webinar, are attending today. And we hope to have some time for questions and answers as well, to be able to make this a lively discussion. I would like to also say that this discussion is being recorded, so there will be a file that we'll be able to share for those who are not able to make it, or if you want to share this with your friends and colleagues. With that, I'll hand this over to Dagmar. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Igor and Neha, and a very warm welcome to everyone, and thanks for having me. Let me start by saying that declining female labor force participation rate in India has been an established cause of concern. According to an ILO report on care work and care jobs for the future of decent work from 2018, family responsibilities were among the top reasons for women's inactivity in the labor market globally. So hence, understanding the dynamics of paid and unpaid domestic work within households is important to advance a decent work agenda in India and beyond. Now, at the same time, paid domestic work has become one of the growing areas of employment for women in India and elsewhere. The ILO's 5R framework for decent care work, that is to recognize, reduce, redistribute unpaid care work, reward care workers, and ensure representation, that is access to social dialogue and collective bargaining for care workers, offer guidance in measuring, identifying, and addressing obstacles that inhibit access to paid work opportunities. They are all pertinent to advancing a decent work agenda for women workers belonging to different class and skill categories and making empowerment a reality. Now, over the past decade, following the adoption of the ILO Convention number 189 on domestic workers, research insights have emerged globally and in South Asia on working conditions of domestic workers and their role in the care economy of South Asia. These insights have translated into recommendations on the types of policy reforms that are needed towards formalization and access to rights for domestic workers. Yet, we know very little about the paid and unpaid domestic work dynamics of households' work and its influence on the employment relationship, beginning from mobility needed to meet the demand for jobs in this sector, recruitment, wage bargaining and working conditions, accessing social security and fundamental rights for workers, and grievance redressal. Now, in South Asia, ILO's Work in Freedom program has demonstrated successfully the use of a political economy lens to address the forced labor conditions in vulnerable sectors, promote mobility for paid work with choice for working migrant women workers, and produce robust evidence to underpin policy efforts to push forward a decent work agenda. In India, the Work in Freedom program has extensively worked with ILO constituents, and I must say especially with trade unions, to address deficits in access to decent work for domestic workers. Now, the study of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements that we are looking at today is an important contribution by ILO's Work in Freedom program towards understanding the perspectives of employers and of domestic workers. So drawing upon multiple rounds of survey, targeting around 10,000 households, in particular in Bengaluru and Chennai, The findings of this study will allow regulators to understand employer and worker motivations better, as well as how it allows worker organizations to better tune their advocacy strategies to the local and social realities of domestic workers' employers. The study complements, in fact, an earlier study conducted in 2016 and 17 by the Institute for Human Development, which was focusing in those years on Delhi, New Delhi, and Mumbai. While similar questions have been posed to aid a comparative perspective, the IIHS study builds forward on the earlier methodology by using an innovative urban sampling technique by drawing the sample from households belonging to different income categories, as balancing paid and unpaid work at home is a challenge for women across different class categories. I really sincerely appreciate the efforts put in by the IIHC research team to produce 3 exhaustive reports based on the study, despite, as we know, several challenges that were posed by the COVID-19 pandemic in data collection and analysis, and encourage really the participants and readers to engage and reflect on these important findings. I would also like to express my deep appreciation for colleagues' efforts, especially Neha Vadavan, National Project Coordinator of ILO's Working Freedom Program in India, and of course, Igor Bosk, our Chief Technical Advisor of the Working Freedom Program. Really for your initiative in both conceiving and designing and also overseeing the completion of the study that we are going to hear about today. So let us hear now from the authors in more detail, and really excited to find out more of what you can tell us from your findings. Thank you very much. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you very much, Dagmar, for really setting the tone of the discussion that we look forward to. I just wanted to, just highlight that in the work that we've done in India, we've worked through several partners in the field, worked in several cities, and I think the insights we've got through trade unions in terms of the struggles and the need to recognize domestic work as a sector that deserves exhaustive social protection is something that we all understand and underline. However, in the work that we've done looking at fundamental principles and rights at work, promoting these, and the the Convention 189 that Dagmar also touched upon, I think evidence is so important, right, in trying to actually push for policy and programs and schemes to be designed. And I think in doing so, this particular study is contributing and hopes to. I really think we can take this forward in a very exhaustive way, because we're looking at a very large sample, and I hope Gautam will spend a little bit of time talking to us about how the sample was drawn. I'd just like to also say that I think COVID was a huge stumbling block, but I think we overcame those obstacles as we went along, and the fantastic effort that has been made by the entire team is something that must be really underlined. So without much further ado, let me hand over to Gautam, Antara, Divya, and Rashi for the presentation, and I look forward to the Q&A and discussion post. Over to you, Gautam.
Thank you very much, Neha, Dagmar, and Igor. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are going to try and be as close to about 60 minutes as possible. So I'm going to get right to it so that we have a significant amount of time for questions and answers. So one of the core things about these 3 studies that you're going to see today is a switch in emphasis from studying domestic workers to studying employers of domestic workers. And I want to underline that I think this is a valuable shift, because when questions of the implementation of social protection or improvements in decent work conditions are discussed in informal work, one of the big questions is the institutional structure of who the employer is and where the workplace is in actually delivering this social protection. So therefore, understanding the perceptions of employers and their current practices is key, not only to understand the kind of architecture of social protection domestic work must have, but also to think about its delivery mechanisms and actual processes in making sure those entitlements reach domestic workers in the end. So what we're seeing today are 3 studies. The first is called Reproducing a Household, Recognizing and Assembling Paid and Unpaid Domestic Work in Urban India. The second is called Deficits in Decent Work. And the third is Employer Practices and Perceptions. I will begin with the first and will present all 3 studies one after the other as a team. When we look at the first question of reproducing a household, drawing on what Dagmar just said about the recognition framework of recognize, reduce, and redistribute, also written about by Elson, our first study focuses on the question of recognition. What does it take to reproduce a household? We use the term housework to denote this structure. And within housework, we take 2 categories. The first, called domestic services, and this includes services like cooking, procurement, food preparation, and upkeep, and questions of separated from caregiving services, particularly for children and the elderly. What this tells us is about a question of 2 categories of different types of tasks. And we took, drawing on international studies that had looked at housework and time use survey studies of domestic work, to get 33 different tasks within these 6 activity clusters. Within each, there is a consideration of work that is paid. So you will see the spectrum of households that hire no paid domestic workers, in which all the work, both for domestic services and caregiving, is unpaid work by members of the household, to the extreme right, where all work is paid domestic work and no work is done as unpaid work by members of the household. And the question we wanted to ask is, where in the distribution do urban Indian households lie? What is the part of the household's reproduction that engages paid domestic work, and what takes the form of unpaid work by members of the household? These 2 categories are also important connectors to us, because India's National Sample Surveys, Time Use Survey Series, and a lot of our statistical databases also uses the category of domestic services and caregiving services. And we wanted to allow a frame that would speak across different statistical databases. One of the questions that is key for us here then was to think about what Neha mentioned about our sampling method. The general structure in Indian cities is that sampling across income is very difficult, because researchers do not have access to household level income data. And a lot of income data in India is difficult to work with because of the irregularity and self-reported nature of often informal incomes that form the dominant nature of India's urban employment, as well as our rural employment. So in one way, the question was that if we wanted to find a large sample in Bangalore and Chennai that worked across income without income data, the proxy we have used is a unique spatial sampling method developed by the Geospatial Lab at IIHS that uses a series of proxies like street networks, vegetation cover, density, and built form analysis to divide city neighborhoods into finely grained socioeconomic clusters. And you'll see the 3 colors on the right. These are examples of those clusters. And you'll see that even within a neighborhood, as we all know who live in Indian cities, there can be patches at street level of different kinds of socioeconomic status. The spatial sampling method allowed our researchers to enter a particular colored area and sample households within that area. And the question we had is, would that give us a fairly distributive range across households with self-reported income? And the good news is that if you see this total of 9,636 households spread evenly across the 2 cities, you will see a very high number of low-income households. Now, the division that emerged was to see low-income households as under 300,000 rupees annual household income. A quick comparison for that is that the government of India, in much of its social protection policies, uses this 300,000, what we call 3 lakh in India, as the definition of low-income group households in, say, food, right to food legislation and poverty line estimations. So actually our definition of low income is fairly consistent with government definitions of low income households and allows us a useful comparator. This is one of the unique things about this data set, which many Indian data sets have been criticized, particularly lately, of underrepresenting and undersampling low-income households. So I think this allows us, like Neha was saying, to really think about how this method can travel, particularly to other cities across the world, where income data may be insufficiently available, where government data may have strong identified gaps, or where incomes themselves may be irregular and difficult to measure. And so that's a freestanding contribution of the study we'd be happy to talk about in more detail. The first findings then, as we go through, and we will only briefly give findings for each part given the length of time. How long does it take? So one of the things we find is that domestic services in Bangalore can take up to 8 hours of cumulative time per day per household. This figure in Chennai is up to 6.4 hours cumulative time per day. You'll see significant variations across high, medium, and low income households. And this is one of the findings that is consistent across our report, that averages hide deep variations, and that socioeconomic stratification among households is critical in order to understand what is happening with paid and unpaid work within the home. What's important for us is that if we look at ILO's global estimates, places urban India in the highest quartile of the time burden of reproducing a household. And it has significant then impacts for many effects that we'll discuss later. There are definitions and movements. Food preparation takes the most time, followed by cleaning. And it is also important to see that caregiving services can take up to 4.4 hours per day in Bangalore and up to 4.2 hours per day in Chennai. The next part about the next finding that I'd like to highlight is the question of how much of this time is then given to paid domestic work. Overall, 54% of households in Bangalore engage a paid domestic worker for at least one of the 33 tasks. There's huge variation here. 77% of high-income households do so. And one big surprising finding for us was that 21% of low-income households in Bangalore, often thought to be the suppliers of domestic work labor, are actually also employers in engaging paid domestic work. In Chennai, the figure is 32%. High-income households remain at 77%, but it is only 7.5. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. A 7.5%, a more expected figure. This also indicates deep differences among the metropolitan regions themselves, a fact that we'll come back to when we think about the scale of the labor market for domestic work. In many cases, when we think about these divisions, we're also looking at structures that explain the resilience of domestic work as a strong employment sector. And we'll come back later to say that our regression models that we don't present in detail here show that the demand for this paid domestic work, which is already high, is growing with urbanization, infrastructure, income, and house size. And therefore, the stability and importance of domestic workers in urban employment sector cannot be underplayed. Anta, you have to unmute.
So another way to look at the distribution of housework between paid and unpaid domestic work would be to look at this distribution of these. That means is when a household engages a paid domestic worker for an activity, how much of the total work is given out to a worker and how much of it remains to be done by somebody in the household. What this measure allows us, among other things, is to see the value of domestic work in reproducing a household. And in this data, we do see that especially high and medium income households depend on domestic workers to do large shares of this housework. Now, there are and can be several patterns, and I'll only highlight a few. Firstly, we see that in domestic service, which includes cleaning, preparing food, upkeep, and procurement, when the domestic workers is engaged, a larger proportion of the total work is actually done by them compared to someone in the household. For cleaning activities in particular, this remains high across high and medium income groups, which is to say, in other words, there is a very strong substitution of unpaid work in cleaning activities with paid work when the domestic worker comes for cleaning activities. Now, the data also shows us variations among households of different income groups for different cluster of activities. For example, in domestic services, the amount of this ratio can range from 84% of the work being done by a domestic worker in high-income households to 25% of the work being done by domestic workers in the household between high and low income groups within the same city of Chennai. Now, in the personal interviews, when we asked them further, we found out that low income groups were hiring in a very different pattern. So they would hire for, let's say, one activity like washing utensils, and not like for the whole range of activities which a medium or a high income household would do. The second thing is we have variation within food preparation as an activity cluster. So in Chennai, when a medium or a high income household hires someone to prepare food, they give out about 87 to 97% of the work. But in Bangalore, this was lower at 67 to 70%. It is worth noting here what it tells us that the distribution of housework between paid and unpaid work cannot only be explained by the nature of the activity, as within the same activity, it differs between cities. So there are other factors as well. For example, we know that some of these activities like cooking carry very strong associations with who can and cannot do it, discriminating on the basis of one's caste locations. There's also a gendered expectation from women in India to participate in the final stages of cooking or to closely manage the quality of it. Next slide, please. So now this also takes me to the next point, that what does a relatively lower ratio mean? That some amount of the work is still done by someone within the household. How much is that and how many hours is that is the question. Now, when we do look at the unpaid hours that remain within the households, when a household hires a domestic worker, we see an expected reduction in the hours, but there still remains significant hours of unpaid work. Now, if we would continue with the example of food preparation in Bangalore, among high-income households, even when they hired somebody for cooking, they reported 1.5 hours of unpaid work daily in the activity. Put simply, there is no need substitution. It does not free time, but significant amount of unpaid hours still remain, and this is deeply gendered. And this also leaves us with other questions about what to do with these remaining unpaid hours. Gautam will speak a little bit more about the gender distribution of this housework.
One of the questions that he picks up always is an expectation of the gender distribution of housework between men and women within the same housework. Now here, we first began by wondering if men and women do similar quantum of work by hours, and then had to change our question because the truth is that in our data within domestic services, only 26 to 30% of men report any participation in different cleaning activities, which means that men are largely absent in both these urban locations from domestic services. And when they do better in procurement and upkeep, but women, even in those activity clusters, dominate those hours of work. We also see variations, again, like Antara said, within activity clusters. For example, 36% of households did report that particular activities, and this is where the gendered connotation of activities is important, 36% of households, only men purchased meat from an outside source for the household. But even here, there were 28% of households where only women procured that meat. In water procurement, something that will not surprise any scholars of South Asia, in 36% of households, only women were responsible for the procurement of water. It was only in 25% that only men did. So not only are men present far less than women in any participation, when they participate, this translates directly into hours. Female heads of household report participating in 65 to 74% of all hours in the task, while men report being present only in 28 to 31%. There is a peculiar gap in which men report ironing in very large numbers, which is something that we have not explored further. But in other words, adult women in households without paid domestic workers, on average, work 3 times more work hours than men. And I think this is important. The exception here is caregiving. Men report much higher participation rates in caregiving, but this is skewed by elderly care rather than child care, with variations within that. But 40 to 60% of men reported participating in elderly care, which is, I think, a fact that is worth noting. Now, if this is the gender distribution of households where paid domestic work has not been hired. What happens when paid domestic work is engaged? Once paid domestic workers are engaged, as expected, the substitution does occur. Participation rates fall drastically, but this is deeply gendered. When paid domestic workers are hired, the participation of men goes down from, for example, for cleaning, the already low 25 to 30% to 8%. It also reduces for women from the 70% down to 20-25%. But yet again, like Antara said, significant participation remains, significant unpaid hours remain even after hiring paid domestic workers. So therefore, in caregiving services, the different pattern emerges. Even when paid domestic workers are engaged, the opposite effect occurs. Men still report high rates of participation, whether co-caring or being supervising or being present during the time of care, but women's time deeply reduces. So for example, when paid domestic work is hired for childcare, for women, participation rates drop from 60 to 70% to 22 to 25% for tutoring and pacifying children, and down to 32 to 36% for feeding and dressing. We'll come back to this later in the second study, where one of the core reasons why women employers reported hiring paid domestic work was actually to free up time, not for labor force participation, but for substituting child and elderly care duties. And okay. So when we close our finding for the first study, we come with a set of dynamics. First, hours remain high disproportionately across income classes, but they vary across tasks in ways which we better understand. A lot of the literature on domestic work in the North Atlantic, in Europe and North America talks about the engines of liberation effect, the presence of washing machines or better technology for procurement of water. But those impacts are paid work are not quite seen in the South. It is very important to understand that unpaid hours remain very significant when paid domestic workers are engaged, and gender differentiation remains very strong. Hiring paid domestic workers impacts men and women very differently. In regression models that we have not shown in this presentation, we find two important effects. The first is that proxies for urbanization, like how with income or household size or infrastructural improvement, the rates and probability of hiring paid domestic work in medium and low households rises as much as high income households. Remember that the variation right now is 77% engagement for high income and between 50 and 20 for medium and low. So this indicates what I was saying earlier about urbanization leading to a strong and positive rising demand for domestic work, which in countries like India, where low and medium income households are expected to transition and move up the income ladder, indicates the stability of domestic work as a sector. But this trend is mediated by non-market inequalities. One very important one is about caste. In regression models, we see that even though the odds of hiring domestic workers for every 1,000 rupees increase in household income go up for all households, they go up less for marginalized caste households belonging to what in Indian government literature is referred to as scheduled caste or scheduled tribe communities or Dalit communities. They go down lesser than dominant caste households. So therefore, there is still variations in the market by identity in a labor market that is strongly marked by identity in many ways. The question that Dagmar brought up about female labor force participation is a very important question here. The fact of significant residual unpaid work indicates that paid domestic work doesn't free up time for wage work so neatly. The second part that's important, again, in the regression analysis not presented here, is that even across education and income, university-educated women employees in our sample did not leverage paid domestic work to undertake waged work outside the home, indicating that the constraints and factors that inhibit women's paid wage labor force participation outside the home extend far beyond what paid domestic work can compensate and substitute for. Our final two findings of the first report are that averages across income, deep variations across the nature and dynamics of paid and unpaid work. It is very important to understand these particular variations. For example, the example of food preparation by high-income households and its relationship to caste and gender roles that Antara highlighted. And finally, there is an important distinction that the market and understanding the dynamics of domestic work may be more appropriately scaled to metropolitan regions, because both the rates of paid domestic work, the ratio of paid and unpaid hours, and the substitution effect that occurs when you hire domestic workers are very different in Bangalore and in Chennai, indicating a need to differentiate at a city region scale. We'll now move over to the second report. Ashi.
In our second report, we continue to focus on employers. In doing so, we seek to document not only existing practices within the employer and employee relationships, but also assess the perceptions and rationale and basis that underlie how employers in urban India value and perceive domestic work and domestic workers. Next slide, please. In this report, our sample, so we had a total sample in the first report of about 9,636 households. We take a subset of that sample in this report and ask employers about the quality of employment. And that was 3,067 households. So as Gautam already said, we see that there is low-income households are not just, again, like suppliers of domestic workers, but also employ domestic work. So that has been something that has been reiterated in the second report as well. The type of works that we looked at was live-out part-time work, and the quality of employment that we will take you through is recruitment, income security, employment and work security, and social security. The key findings on reasons and basis for hiring in this report was hiring for time, which is to free up time. And we saw this pretty consistent over Bangalore and Chennai. About 40% of households reported that they hired to free up time to do more care work. And only much lesser was to free up time for paid work. As discussed in the first report, where we've argued that paid domestic work in the Indian context is indeed often not leveraged to increase opportunities for paid work outside the home. And that's something that we see here as well. In the recruitment channels, we find that this is a thickly spatial and social market where 67% in Bangalore, 59% in Chennai said that they recruited from within the neighborhoods, and the reputation of the worker in such hiring becomes disproportionately important because everyone is they're looking at referencing in a very small spatial area. Caste turned out to be in a very high, sort of in Bangalore, we had 25% of high income households, particularly saying that caste of the worker was very, very important when they hired, as compared to only 14% that said that it was not important at all. Chennai was much less, looked at caste as a preference for hiring. Similar sort of patterns emerge also in religion, where employers looked at, the religion of a worker as they hire. And continue, sort of looking at the existing literature, domestic work, because it's seen as an extension of the unpaid care work of home, continues to be undervalued as a skill, and attributes matter more. So attributes such as trustworthiness, punctuality, etc., matter more to employers, and skill is not seen as relevant.
So if you take this basis of thinking about the recruitment pattern that is both deeply spatialized in the neighborhood and then values attributes more, there is a pattern that emerges repeatedly through our reports of an undervaluing of domestic workers' skilled work. And this reflects then in the valuation of wages. For the top 50% of domestic workers, we can see why domestic work is understood as a stable and good paying sector. For the first 30% in particular, median earnings are at 5,000 rupees and above per worker. But the question is that if we look at how we do wage calculations for live-out part-time workers who work in multiple houses and therefore the determination of their earnings is often tricky, the metric we have used is to ask the question a different way. How many households would a worker have to work in to reach even the state minimum wage for domestic workers? Both the states that Bangalore and Chennai are in, that is Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, have established specific minimum wages for domestic workers. And we found that in Karnataka, the bottom 30% of workers in our sample would have to work in 4 houses to make minimum wage, and the bottom 10% in 6 houses to just make minimum wage. In Tamil Nadu, the number is similar, but the bottom 10% would have to work in 8 houses to make minimum wage. It's worth noting that at the time of our survey, domestic worker unions in Tamil Nadu were on strike, arguing that the state minimum wage in Tamil Nadu, which is much lower than Karnataka's, was actually deeply insufficient. So therefore, this 8 houses and 4 houses for Tamil Nadu is to reach a minimum wage that workers argue is not, in fact, a sufficient living wage. If you then sort of said, all right, how many households would Tamil Nadu domestic workers need to work in to reach Karnataka's minimum wage, so Bangalore's minimum wage, the bottom 10% would have to work in an unimaginable 12 households simultaneously to make minimum wage. And in Delhi, which has a higher minimum wage than both Bangalore and Chennai, the bottom 30% in both Bangalore and in Chennai would have to work in 5 to 6 households. What we're seeing here, therefore, that the wage compensation is deeply insufficient when compared to minimum living wages. And what's also important is to say that for live-out part-time workers, the state minimum wage laws are not influencing the wage labor market. We'll come back to this finding and showing how wage determination, in fact, occurs at the neighborhood scale through multiple non-market mechanisms rather than just thinking about the demand and supply of workers. The difficult finding in the research, however, is that even though these wages show deep inadequacy for a majority of workers outside the top quartile, when asked, employers believe, in fact, that they pay generously versus being asked whether they pay adequately. 55% of Bangalore employers believe they pay generously, 38% believe that they pay adequately. There is a debate, I think, to think about, which we will flag later, is that the basis of determining wage detailed in our reports talks about the difference between wages being determined by tasks, very common for live-out metropolitan domestic workers, versus rate cards that have been created versus hours. And in many cases, unions in India have been moving towards rate cards to shift wage determination by task as a way to increase them. And we'll come back to this mode of organizing around wage increases later in the study.
We also asked employers about their perceptions and the kinds of practices that existed with reference to non-wage benefits. One of the first things we asked them was about maternity entitlements. It was quite interesting to note that several employers said that they felt quite empathetic towards their workers, but were unwilling to take the responsibility for maternity breaks or any kind of entitlements. So as you see here, 36% of participants reported that they would support some form of maternity entitlement, some sort of support, but most preferred discontinuation or dismissal. And one of the reasons for this was that employers thought of it in terms of a large replacement cost that they would have to incur if they let go of the worker or if they continue to pay them while also hiring a second person to do the work. In contrast, when it came to the question of illnesses, we found that a lot of employers were willing to support, and there were several practices in this regard. They were more willing to support, as you see here, about 40% in Bangalore and 37% said that they would give some kind of support for treatment. There was also the language of mutual dependency that we see in the third report that came up when employers thought about supporting their workers. But when we talk about leave, whether it was weekly leave, sick leave, or annual leave, it was quite interesting that even though employers said that their workers could take leave, in Bangalore, for example, they reported that their workers rarely or almost never took leave. Now, this is also related to the question of employment security. Perhaps in many workers' mind, the problem and the concern is also of the punitive action if they take leave, the fear of being replaced by another worker if they decide to go on leave. With reference to maternity entitlement, I just also wanted to add that this question of maternity support also leads to larger questions of social protection. What happens when a domestic worker chooses to go on maternity break? Who supports it, whether it is the state or the employer, is a question that we must talk about at some point. For the next slide. And here now we'll just sort of sum up the larger conversations that we were having in this report, and many of these points have been discussed in depth in report 3. But when we talk about domestic work, one of the first things that we found was that many employers did not consider domestic work to be a form of work. In many cases, it was thought of an extension of the kinds of work that women did at home. So it was deeply gendered. And when it intersects with caste, we also realize that it is undervalued and unrecognized often. Because of the part-time nature of work, we also realize that employers often disassociated from taking responsibility for the worker. And this is particularly important when we talk about social protection and the question of who takes responsibility for the worker. The next point that we would like to talk about is about the forms of formalization. What kinds of formalization practices can occur in this sector? And this is something that various unions have talked about and has been a conversation in many parts of the world, in fact. Are we talking about, rate cards and minimum wages laws? But as we see, there is a neighborhood effect. Can we have minimum wage laws at the city level? Or then do we need to start thinking about this as, at the neighborhood level? The question is also about what kind of social protection do we give the worker, and how does this relationship between the employer and the employee then get regulated? And we talk about this in report 3, where several employers said they simply don't want the state to step into their home. So they do not want to be engaged in any sort of formalization or legal coverage or social protection. And this is interesting because if you compare this with other sectors of work, there have been some conversations around entitlement. And here in domestic work, then the question remains, how do we move the conversation from a language of empathy and care, which a lot of employers use while talking about providing support to their workers, and move from that language of empathy and care to that of entitlements and rights? So what are the forms of social support, social protection that we can give that move away from the language of support? And would that take form of direct kind of payments, or would it be in the form of insurance? And since this labor market is so deeply specialized and segmented, the question also remains, how do we sort of engage with both the unions as well as various resident welfare associations? In several cities, we've seen that tripartite organizations have sort of, have come together. This is also a practice that we've seen in the construction sector in the country. But in the case of domestic work, since work takes place within the household of the employer, the question of tripartite organization then gets a little complicated. Who becomes the third arm of this tripartite organization? Is it the union? Is it the state? Is it the employer and the worker? So these questions still continue to remain. The fourth point that we'd like to talk about is the idea around, the personalization of reputation of the worker. The fact that the worker has to constantly live up to a certain reputation of being a good worker, where sort of the personal traits and behavior of the worker matters way more than the actual skills of the worker, because as we noted earlier, domestic work was considered to be unskilled work. And so a lot of this work sort of rotates around the personal reputation that the worker is able to maintain in the neighborhood that she works in. It's also related to caste and regional dynamics, and we'll talk about this further in the next report. The main question that we'd like to also talk about here is, what does it mean in our deeply urbanizing cities? What does it mean for the quality of employment and the quality and the wages? And are we going to move towards a direction where the quality of work improves along with an increase in wages? And how do we take this forward in a setup where the employer-employee relationship as of today is not governed either by the state or a tripartite organization? We now move to the third study, which looked at the employer practices and perceptions on paid domestic work. This study actually provides a really deep qualitative archive, or, in some sense, we use the language and the articulations that the employers used when they talked about domestic work. In particular, we were interested in understanding what is the value that employers placed on domestic work, and what is their perception of both domestic work as well as, recruitment and domestic work and the domestic worker. There are three segments in this report. We talk about recruitment, what are the channels through which workers have been hired, and what are the recruitment preferences. We also talk about employment relationship and the employer's outlook towards legal coverage and social protection for domestic workers. In terms of recruitment channels, we see that it is a highly specialized market. We talked about it a little bit in the previous report, but through the qualitative interviews, we saw that there was a language of safety, trust, quality, verification that was used with reference to neighborhood networks. The reason somebody preferred to employ a worker from their own neighborhood was because it implicitly meant verification of both the type, the quality of work that the worker did, but also some sort of safety that it employed. In certain long-term relationships where there was, either the worker had been with the same family for several generations, or the same family had employed workers from different generations of the worker's family, the idea of trust and loyalty was talked about quite deeply. Of course, there were several new forms of hiring services where people hired for particular tasks, but part-time domestic work still remains from these traditional channels of work. We also asked employers what were the preferences when they were recruiting for a worker. And it was really interesting to see that identity-based parameters such as age, religion, caste, language of the worker mattered quite a bit. It was also really interesting for us to see the word age, because we heard both that they did not want workers that were too old because they couldn't do the work. Neither did they want workers that were too young, because that would mean childcare and other kinds of responsibilities that the employer couldn't deal with. I'll end with the idea of subjective judgment, the fact that employers expected a composite set of traits and behaviors from their workers. The worker had to be loyal, the worker had to be trustworthy, had to be hygienic, punctual, all of these traits that were different across households, but the worker was expected to keep up with it. And of course, because domestic work was not considered to be work in that sense, skills were considered to be of the least importance. We also looked at how wages were determined by employers. So domestic work is regular salaried work, and the absence of state intervention, wages are negotiated really between the worker and the employer. And we found that neighborhood rates and tasks and units of work was how wages were determined. And there was some room for negotiation, which were based on household specific characteristics, such as number of rooms in a household, the number of people within the household, etc. And what we found was the employers reporting that they wanted to follow wage rates because they feared backlash from the neighborhood. Like we said, that this is ethically spatial labor market, and employers and employees just exist in closed networks. And therefore, this backlash in sort of increasing wages was something that the employers were worried about. Employment security is another question that we asked the employers. And the perception was that domestic work was more secure than other types of informal work. So they compared it to street vendors or construction workers. And they said that this was regular salaried work. It was work that was there throughout the year, and therefore it was more secure. The employer's perception on workers was, sort of deeply subjective and varied. And that's something that we said before. And workers were expected to match a set of notional requirements. And therefore, it was difficult for them to sort of understand what an employer wanted, and that was something that came up. And the other thing around employment security was that many employers felt that was not something that was in their that was not something that was their responsibility to provide employment security to the workers, and that as long as the workers followed instructions and were doing work that was considered important within the household, they could continue to have their employment. The other thing that we asked employers was about workplace facilities. And again, there was a variation in attitude between employers. So, questions such as access to drinking water or toilet or food is something that we asked. And where many employers reported that drinking water was something that they offered the workers, they also then brought in, very caste and practices such as segregating utensils. And because that was possible, water was sort of freely offered to the workers. And here then we see a shift when it came to sort of giving access to toilets to workers. Here, high income households, because they were able to segregate toilets within their home, because they had an extra toilet for a worker, or they lived in a complex that had separate sort of toilet facilities for their workers, they were able to offer that. And as compared to then middle income or low income households where such segregation was not possible because employers said that there just wasn't enough space in the house. So, therefore this kind of, worked differently. And then food was seen surprisingly as an extension of sort of, non-wage benefits, where many people said when asked, that they offer food to their workers. But here also there was a duality of language between care and control. And these were seen really as acts of altruism and not a worker right. So then highly then individualized to each worker. Another thing to note is that many employers mentioned that they did not feel that they needed to give such access to their workers because they were only part-time workers and they were in their house for a very little time. Here, we saw that the employers recognized part-time nature of domestic work, but didn't recognize that that workers worked across multiple homes during the duration of the day. The other sort of non-wage support that we looked at was, around leaves. And again, frequent and unreported leaves were looked at by employers as inconvenient. And also because domestic work is something that happens throughout the day on a weekly basis, considering employers were hesitant to sometimes offer weekly offs, although some employers did report that weekly offs were the right of a worker and that they did offer them. But in that sense, a long absence almost always led to a replacement of the worker and loss of employment. Medical support is something that the employers said was their responsibility. Again, reasons such as mutual dependence and also mirroring sometimes their own workplace benefits. In COVID, we saw that there was an increase in sort of looking at getting workers vaccinated. But then again, there is that element of mutual dependence and also securing the health of the employers themselves. Like Divya mentioned, there is an idea of the support of maternity leave, but who should do it, and should it be the government? Should it come on the employer? And they just considered it a very complex arrangement. And most said that they would either replace the worker or discontinue the worker if they were to go on a maternity break. And getting the employment back, so getting the worker back would depend on how the employer felt, how good the worker was. So that perception in sort of return to work after a period of maternity break was sort of reported. Continuing with maternity benefits, the need for childcare infrastructures for domestic workers was again something that we asked employers. Mostly were only sort of looked at it. Many agreed that such infrastructures are required at a city level that don't exist in Indian cities, but they themselves were only sort of keen to offer this arrangement very occasionally because of fears such as who would then take care of the child when the worker was working, or other fears of having their household be a place where children are sort of brought in. So, but then again, perception of children's education as an employer responsibility was very, very high. Many said that they were willing to give advance loans for children's education, buy books, pay for a school fee, or even offer lump sum sort of amounts that they didn't expect paybacks on, or only expected partial returns on, and that was an employer responsibility, and that's something that that was reported. Again, as subjective notions of employer responsibilities were to honor the verbal contract. We know that there isn't a formal contract in domestic work, so therefore to sort of say that if a worker comes in, then they would honor the verbal contract on how much money was going to be paid, etc. And this ideas of being fair, again, very subjective, what that means, and depends on each employer. counseling. Many employers reported that they counsel their workers, whether it was money management or health management or how they should take care of their children or their familial matters is something that employers were said that they did. And also this idea of safety at workplace. So saying that if they were in their homes, then the safety of the worker was the employer's responsibility.
So in this third study, one of our inquiries was to understand the employer's outlook on having legal and social protection for domestic workers. We asked 3 questions. What do you think of having a law or policy for domestic workers? What do you think of having social protection for domestic workers? And if there was a way to provide it, how would you be willing to contribute it? And we think that these responses to these questions make for 2 key contributions. One, it creates an archive of employer outlook and the language they use on the question of regulating this sector. It is a perspective that is under studies and underreported due to challenges of pursuing interviews with employers in any sector at this middle. Second, it offers us a possibility of categorizing the varied outlooks, which can guide strategic communication plans for opening a longer conversation, negotiation with willing and ambivalent employers in different ways. I'll present a few insights from the transcriptions we have, but the responses are presented in much more detail in the report. Now to the first question, what do you think of having a law or policy for domestic workers? As is expected, employers' orientation towards having an regulation of the employment in this regulation, terms of leave, terms of termination, and so on, is to avoid it and discourage it. However, on closer reading of the narratives, we have reason to believe that all unwillingness is not the same. We have tried to group responses together to be able to think of the variety that we see, but not be paralyzed by it. And we can largely see 3 sets of responses based on their intention for any legal intervention in the employment relationship. Now, the first set of responses are an outright refusal for the need of any such regulation. Either the employer says the domestic work is not proper work, or they say that domestic work already pays well and has good working conditions. And I quote one employer, "Everybody is giving a reasonable wage and workers will surely ask for it. They work in 3 to 5 houses and receive more than 10,000 a month as salary." Now, it was not just one, but many employers who held similar notions that domestic workers were earning a decent wage and that it would exceed 10,000 a month at least. However, from several studies of domestic workers in India, one can say that these assumptions do not hold true. Now, a second set of responses are also not keen for regulation, but they speak more explicitly about avoiding scrutiny and regulation of employer practices. And the number one reason for worry was wage regulation, the issue of it. So even said that the revision of wages can hurt the workers by affecting the demand, and I quote, "There are many people who may not be earning well, but they need the support of domestic workers, and they may have to discontinue hiring them." Another employer adds, "If you are going to hold me accountable for these people, then I would think twice before hiring them." Now, when we read these narratives, along with the findings of report 1, where we see that much of the housework is given out to a domestic worker when they hire one, now letting go of domestic worker might not be as simple as they appear in these narratives. There were also employers who were a little apprehensive that such intervention may ignore employers' interest altogether, and they will tilt the balance towards the workers. And a third set of responses now signal about a group of employers who may be more open to some form of policy intervention in the sector, whom we call ambivalent employers. But their hesitation stems from a distrust in state's ability to implement something that can be meaningful. An employer reflects on the question and says, the state in India, or the government in India, will not be able to create a system that can monitor so many employers, and the employers will find a way to circumvent it. However, there are some who, despite the hesitancy, thought that it would be good to have legal intervention, at least to set new benchmarks for employer attitudes. Next slide, please. Now, moving on to the question about employers' outlook on having social protection. While having the employment under scrutiny is a topic of tension, the question whether domestic workers should have social protection or not, there is more consensus on this, and there is a more positive orientation among employers. And we sense this opening because of two reasons. One, several employers recognize the need for social protection of domestic workers because they knew about their financial hardships from their personal interactions. Some even recognize that the compensation that these workers get is not in line with the value of the work. Secondly, as many other studies and also the previous report that we just presented, several employers already provide some equivalent of non-wage benefits. But the problem there is that of discretion and variation. Who pays, who does not, and who pays for what. Now, when we look at the language and the logic of recognizing the need for social protection or for providing the non-wage support, we see that this openness to social protection is largely in the language of care, help, and sympathy. Very few, if any, use the language of rights and entitlements. Then, while there is certainly an opening for social protection policy with employer contribution, is there any danger in such a thing? Can one be cautious to balance it with the logic and language that will eventually identify these as entitlements of rights of domestic workers and not only care and sympathy? Now, moving on to the last question in this set about employers' willingness to contribute to a social security fund. Now, we do see some willingness. Some employers give a range of how much they would be willing to contribute, from saying 1% to 20% of the salary. But here there is another question, that if such a support would be deducted from existing salary amounts or be additions to it. And in our interviews, what we see is that many employers see the contribution as deduction from the overall salary, which is the existing salary. Not only that, we also see some tension alongside the willingness to on the question of contribution. There was the question of affordability, which included employers not being able to contribute or having other conflicting economic needs. Secondly, some employers were willing to contribute, but it was conditional. Say the state to take some responsibility or willing, and there's a longer relationship with the worker, or employers wanting to see the benefits come directly to their worker and not to the group of domestic workers in general. And thirdly, some employers say that the workers may themselves not be interested in a support that is not going to help them for their immediate needs. And I'll close with this. Lastly, there was the lack of clarity on what are the operational details, how will the domestic workers actually get it, will it be implementable or not, was itself an important factor shaping employers' willingness to support or not. Taking us back to what Gautam said, that entire study also gives insights into how important is it to figure out the operational details of delivering social protection. There was also this issue of what the employers themselves call procedural responsibility. And I quote one, if it's a simple thing linked to my account and it auto debits, I will contribute for sure. But otherwise, even if I want, I won't be able to do it. One may think that these questions of delivery come after, but they seem to be questions that need to be answered parallelly to deciding what the entitlement should be. And I'll hand over to Dee.
I will very briefly sum up the major findings. And this is also our sort of proposition to sort of move the conversation forward. One of the first things that we talk about in the report is the challenge of valuation of work, considering that a lot of this work is controlled at the neighborhood level. There are a lot of arrangements which restrict the fact that certain workers can do certain kinds of work, and the fact that certain kinds of work can only get certain amounts of money. So there is control over the type of work, the nature of work, as well as the wages of the worker. And as I've already said, the intersection with gender and caste keeps it such that the work always remains low-waged. There are also several barriers to dignity of work. As we spoke already, the subjective judgment around the reputation of the worker means that their personal traits and behaviors take precedence over the skill of the worker. And since this is controlled at the neighborhood level, workers rarely have an opportunity to move up the ladder because of the reputation that has already been built in the neighborhood. It connected to this is also the conversation of how do you move away from dominance of the employer at the neighborhood level to that of that one that tilts towards towards workers' organizations and unions. The idea of verification and recruitment is a serious constraint. When we are talking about formulating sector-specific regulations, one of the things that we really need to take into consideration is the idea of redressal mechanisms. What happens when workers are not paid? What happens when the workers' wages remain really low, and in the context of harassment? This is a study that is from the perspective of employers, but several other studies that look at workers' experiences point to the importance of redressal mechanism in this relationship. We know that social protection, next slide. We know that social protection is significant to move the balance towards the workers. As of now, workers depend on employers for easy credit in terms of distress, but we know that this is uneven, this is not regular, and is not available to the worker when they need it at all times. The other two things that we wanted to talk with reference to social protection is that there is some employer hesitancy when it comes to the question of law and policy, because the fear is that the employer will be regulated more than how the workers work. That question remains in the minds of the employer. But with respect to social protection, it was less of a clear no and more of an hesitancy. So the question we also like to ask as a team is, can we actually redirect that hesitancy towards a positive move for some kind of social protection? Finally, we would like to say that all of these are policy questions, but with reference to socio-cultural discriminatory practices, it has to be outside of policy also, because that is a conversation and dialogue that will need to be had between various parties, whether it is the employer, workers' organizations, and the workers themselves. I'd finally like to end by talking about the challenges that we faced while doing this study. This is an in-depth qualitative research study. We interviewed over 400 households, and in between various waves of COVID, and it was also really interesting to see how difficult it can be to get through gated communities where employers can either shut the door on your face, or there are so many multiple layers of gatekeepers who won't just allow us into the homes of the employers. Just to give you an example, in one of the interviewers had about 68% rejection. That was the challenge really in doing this study. And also we have a very rich archive of quotations in the report, which we couldn't read today because of paucity of time, but I'll request all the participants to take a look at that.
So I just want to end by acknowledging the larger team that has worked on this, you see on the slide, and also make, again, a very important mention of our partners at the Center for Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, led by Professor Sanjay Kumar, who managed to, within periods of lockdowns and pandemics, just absolutely insist that we could not compromise on the original stated research intention in a way that I think was very important to us. We've given you a glimpse of the various parts of the reports, and we're happy to take any questions. And I'll stop screen sharing now, and I'll ask Neha to help us moderate the Q&A and direct some of the questions. Thank you all very much for your attention. And I feel quite importantly, feel good that we have managed to hold our 2 years of work and 3 reports to 60 minutes. So that may be the equally impressive achievement from the COVID fieldwork. Over to you, Neha.
Gautam, thank you so much. And I agree, this was right bang on in terms of 60 minutes. Thank you so much for giving us a really wide-ranging insight into what all the 3, I think, really informative reports hold. A big thanks to Antara, Rashi, Divya, and you, Gautam, for leading this work and for today's presentation. I just wanted to, take the opportunity to set the discussion rolling by raising a few points, right, which I hope we can actually reflect upon to see where the findings of the study can take us forward. So the first thing I'd like to, just highlight is that the fact that I think the workplace has really been a challenge, right, in terms of having any sort of legislation come through, any policy come through, because the private household being regulated is really something that has been a major obstacle, I feel, in sort of lobbying for legislative protection. So this really gives us an insight into what employers think. And of course, we understand perceptions of domestic workers and we know what the reality is from their perspective. But I think this gives us a lot of information to build upon in terms of the campaign and the sensitization work that we need to do going forward with employers. I think, you know, it was really interesting when you also talked about traits versus skills, because we have a lot of emphasis on skilling, right? In all sorts of sectors within the informal economy. But again, I mean, what kind of skills are we building upon and which ones should we focus on when we talk about collective bargaining or wage bargaining, asking for better wages, etc. Another, I think, point which was really interesting, and I think, you know, we must reflect on it, which is the various types of tasks, of course, that you've delved into the study, but also to think about food preparation, you know, which I think really gets highlighted in terms of how much time perhaps Indian households spend on the preparation of food, and how we compare when we think about other countries within the Asian context or even in the wider sort of developing context. I think 3.5 hours is a lot of time, you know, and this is, I think, something that came out very clearly in the case of Bangalore and Chennai. Another point I thought which was really interesting is the low-income households accessing care. And as we go forward and talk about care policies, investments by the private sector in care, really what are we looking at? And I think, you know, it was also, I mean, I was thinking about it during the presentation that why is it in Chennai that you have so many more households accessing care when they come from a low income category? Is it because of the presence of other types of industries or sectors which absorb women in large numbers? And I'm thinking, again, of the garment sector, right, which is also another area that we've been working on within the Work and Freedom program. All right. I think, you know, one topic which I'd also like to touch upon is the whole question of, I really like the fact that we've tried to in the study look at wage benefits and non-wage benefits, right? But I would really, I think, take this opportunity to really push the agenda forward in terms of looking perhaps at living wages or adequate wages as a framework. Now, I think it's really interesting that you reported that the top sort of percentile, right, 30% or so, make more than 5,000 rupees per household. And I think there was a question on the average number of households that you've taken to really reach the minimum wage. And perhaps after I finish, you'd like to sort of address that particular question which came up in the chat box. But I think the neighborhood is really a relevant category. And again, I know that there are many trade unionists who are attending today. It would be nice to also hear from them about their experience of engaging with the neighborhood. The RWA is something that we can't run away from in terms of, you know, our strategizing on the ground, right? But again, I think the challenges that are there in terms of looking at RWAs as representative of employers' concerns, and you know, really the legal basis of being able to do so is also something that comes up as a very interesting question. I think, you know, one more point is on the daily discrimination that workers face, right, in the workplace, be it access to toilets or be it access to, you know, basic dignity in terms of, you know, how they can actually perform their tasks with dignity. And I think this is, again, something in terms of the perceptions of employers about how replaceable these workers can be, and perhaps also how caste and, you know, other intersectional categories really impact some of these issues, I think is also important to consider. It was really, I think, well received to see the emphasis on providing medical benefits. And I'm just curious also if the COVID effect had influenced, right, the responses by the employer. And I think it's, again, something we can build on. But I think from a methodological point of view, you know, what Padmaja Barua has talked about in terms of employer benevolence, you know, how do we push it forward? And again, do we see intergenerational variations? I know you perhaps didn't have the time to touch upon it in your presentation, but again, that would be interesting to really think about. And finally, just to say that I think this study is really one step forward in the direction of being able to think about solidarity between different classes of women on the question of outsourcing paid work, of course, from the household, but also in terms of looking at the unpaid care work responsibilities that they encounter on a daily basis. I think there is space for solidarity, but I think that the challenges and the path ahead is really long in terms of being able to get there. But I think this is a really good beginning. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to, of course, ask Divya to come in to ask her question, but also to draw your attention to all the presenters, right? There's some questions in the chat box, which I will read out after this, and then we can take the discussion forward. Thanks once again. So Dia, are you there? Would you like to join us and ask your question or share your comment? Yes.
Yeah,
Dia,
hi. First of all, I think this is an excellent presentation. Really interesting findings. I myself have been working on care issues and women's labor in India for some time. And I'm currently working I'm currently the Oxfam America non-resident research fellow. And I'm working on a paper on female labor force participation in India. I had a few questions. The first thing is that, my own studies and several other studies have shown that when women outsource care and domestic work, they don't necessarily join the labor force. They end up doing more care and domestic work in the household. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. I think you alluded to it a little bit, but I'd like to listen to what you're saying about that. The other thing is you were mentioning that even women from university with university education were not joining the labor force, but were doing other things. Now, Jayati Ghosh has spoken about how undergraduate unemployment rates among undergraduate women is very high, over 32%. What we also know is that very high, like postgraduate women do participate in the labor force, but anything below a postgraduate degree is not getting employed. So how is the labor market kind of interacting with the the paid, unpaid, domestic care sectors within the household, within the community, etc. And the third question I was curious to know is that when you ask men about their care responsibilities, what is the question you asked? Because there is knowledge about the fact that if you ask, for example, if you ask a man, do you do any care activities? And the answer is most likely going to be no. But if you ask very specific questions about do you do child minding, or do you fetch water, or do you do some other specific tasks, they will probably then answer in the affirmative. And then it doesn't still take away from the fact that men do very little work, but I'm just curious to know how you pose that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Dia. Thanks so much. Gautam, would you like to address the three questions and some of the points I've raised, and then we move on to other questions? Is that okay?
Absolutely, can do that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dia, for that. So you're absolutely right. So one of our key findings was that when households hire paid domestic work, the total hours of housework go up. So it's exactly that empirical relation. It surprised us when we saw it. So, and then the question is, why are they going up? Because we were led to, the literature leads us to think about substitution effects, things become more efficient, you have technology entering. And so certainly the total number of hours go up, and they go up independent in the regression models with the increase in house size. So it's a proportionate increase. And that is indicating to new types of supervision, So even if paid domestic work are being engaged, they're being supervised, they're being instructed, they're being monitored, there's still a kind of different kind of presence that's happening. New types of presence in the household get created when paid domestic workers are around. So a lot of women in the qualitative interviews talked about instructing during food preparation, watching in different ways. There's a lot in the material actually about the washing machine in India being a fairly labor-intensive way of washing clothes as opposed to being a mechanical put it. Unlike the ad, it's not fill it, shut it, forget it. It's actually, the cycle is, I can tell you from also my personal experience that with uncertain water infrastructure supply, washing machines have to be watched very carefully because the cycles don't run accordingly. So absolutely, there is the question of more care and more domestic work. So the nature of the work changes, you see, because we did ask in our very detailed time use surveys, the distinction between participating, supervising, monitoring. So that those distinctions are also there a little bit in the data. But the big picture is that the overall hours of housework increase for households when they hire.
Yeah, because the fundamental responsibility of care work still remains with the woman of the household.
Exactly.
So even if the maid burns the food, the female employer is still the most, is the one answerable to the family about why something.
And that was Divya's point about the final gendered notion of a lot of these tasks where paid domestic works aren't able to move that association. And you see similar things on the question that you asked about male activity. So that's precisely so the way we asked it was to work with those 33 tasks. The categories of care work and domestic work were our categories. But we asked very specifically. So for example, within care work also, men do more tutoring than bathing of their children. They buy more medicines for the elderly than they do and take them to medical visits a lot. So within care work, we had 6 or 7 types of activities, and absolutely breaking it by activity allows a richer presence of where they get involved and where they're not than if we just ask them about care work. And that distinction, you note that I talked about the peculiarly high self-reported rates of participation of men in ironing. And again, even when they're present in elderly care, you have a deep distinction between medical appointments versus, and particularly also in bathing and dressing for the elderly men show up. And that could again be a gendered notion of an elderly father where the bathing and dressing is more appropriate in some context for the son rather than the daughter-in-law. So definitely the task breakdown, I think, makes a big difference. And I think using those 33 tasks for the time use survey helped us see, and we were able to give you aggregates here, but the report reports it by task. And so you can see the variations even within those categories. And the last thing I'll say about the question of educated women in labor employment, I think this is the part that we are also, because it wasn't exactly the focus of what we were looking at, we're able to kind of triangulate around it, right? We can sort of say, that even when we hold everything constant, because we have the data that tells us about in which households women did wage work outside the home, comparing it to their education, and we don't see those correlations between hiring of paid domestic workers. Then the qualitative question we asked about the reason for recruitment, again, only 10% of employers say they do it to free up time for wage employment. And then we have the residual unpaid work hours that remain so strong so that the freeing up of time and the substitution effect is mitigated. All of these kind of triangulate around this question of saying that the labor force participation question is much more complex than the question of paid and unpaid domestic work, and that the burden of care work is very significant despite hiring paid domestic work. This then, I think, adds to the other macroeconomic constraints on women's employment, right? The kind of opportunities our macroeconomic structure offers, questions of safety, questions of public transport, questions of childcare and patriarchal norms. So we're able to close one part of that multi-structured loop, but I think we're offering evidence and saying this itself is not going to be a silver bullet of any kind. So that effect is not going to be seen. And I think that's the important part, to sort of say that these effects persist quite strongly.
Thanks, Gautam. And I think, just to add that's why the qualitative round was so important, right? To really draw upon what are really the dynamics and what are the intricacies, I think, of some of these issues that have been brought out. Thanks for your responses. Moving on, we have a question on whether the unit level data can be made available for further research. And we have another question, which was the number of households to reach minimum wage. What is the average hours per household used to build the comparison? For 8 households or for 10 households? I think this is a clarification upon how that calculation has been made. If you could please reflect on that. And then there's a third question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a question, but it's a comment in the chat, which talks about non-wage support may also include support such as mediation in household conflicts. I'm not sure if this is alluding to mediation by employers or by domestic workers itself.
Neha, can we also take Shraddha's question?
Yes, I was just going to read those out. So Shraddha's questions are, in case of part-time workers, one major issue about non-wage entitlements is relating to engagement with multiple employers. So how can this be thought through? The second question is, what were workers' perspectives of formalization using the rate card? Although I know this survey didn't look at workers' perspectives, but perhaps you would like to reflect upon some of the other work you've done with using rate cards. And she's saying that in the location in the NCR, it's seen as stifling their bargaining power. The third is, what role do employers collectives such as RWAs, what role can they play in social security? And another question is, when we look at the continuum of paid and unpaid work, how do domestic workers look at their own lives? Did they speak of care deficit at own households? And I think here, maybe if you have some insight, Divya, to share from the low-income households and what they said in relation to their care responsibilities, I think it would be nice to perhaps take a moment and reflect on that.
Yeah, but perhaps I can answer parts of this, some of these questions. So the first one about, the question around formalization and what did workers think of their own life situations, we can't answer from this report, this set of reports, because they only looked at employers' perspective. I want to say that actually it was really important for us to study employers. We've been working with workers' organizations and unions for a couple of years now. And there came a point where the union said, you keep studying the workers. When will you start studying the employers? Because the change has to come at that end in terms of policy, regulation, social protection, and so on. So this study really then focused on the employer. The question of part-time job, yeah, that's a curious one, right? Because every time we talk to employers, they did not take responsibility for social protection or for, say, something as simple as giving access to toilet within their households. And the constant reason was that the worker is in my house only for 40 minutes. Without sort of recognizing that the worker spent 8 to 10 hours in some cases in various houses in the same neighborhood. So the worker had a full day, even though she had perhaps only 40 minutes in each individual house. So that differentiation between, it being part-time in an individual employer's house, but actually being full-time work is something that we really need to think about a little bit more carefully when we talk about wages and social protection both, because then it's not part-time worker really, she is a full-time worker. What are the other questions?
The question about rate cards.
Yeah, so the rate cards is another interesting thing, because we know that in several areas of various cities or unions and workers organizations have their rate cards. But through this study, we also found that employers really rely on these rate cards that are sort of circulated within their neighborhoods. And these rate cards are sort of a wage ceiling for what you would pay for different tasks. But it was also interesting that several employers said that they would face a backlash if they paid more than what this wage ceiling was. And I would really encourage you to read the report, because there are very interesting quotes there which sort of talk about how, the employer would like to increase wages, but she really worries that, she would have a backlash in the neighborhood and hence has to really stick to this wage card in some sense. So it's a very interesting case where workers' organizations are coming with their rate cards, and the employers are also coming with their own rate cards. And there is, it'd be really interesting to see how the two sort of meet, whether they meet or not at all.
Because one of those wage cards is tacit. Effectively, what a lot of our findings are showing us is that the wage control is happening in this implicit dialogue in a very localized area that workers are not privy to. So it makes the negotiation deeply individualized. But even an individual negotiation has a ceiling to what it can negotiate because of this tacit wage card. But I think the other thing that the experience of rate cards is showing from our other work, for example, it has a different play out, like you were saying, Shraddha, in different parts of NCR. In Bangalore, Geeta Menon and a lot of the unions have reported greater success with it, as have unions in Jaipur, where they feel like the rate card moves the intent to the task as opposed to the time, which for live-out part-time workers is a more effective negotiating tool to raise overall wages. So I think it's a question of, one of the things about rate cards also is that they are really tricky because they are a way to say that if the minimum wage seems to be so unrelated to prevailing wage rates, and that's our key finding, right? That we're such a distance from regulatory living or minimum wages. In one way, rate cards are kind of an experiment also that unions are trying to say, well, how else do I lift this floor? I'm so below the legally mandated floor, but I cannot bring minimum wage to bear in a labor market where wages are determined at neighborhood level and minimum wages are being set at state level, at best at metropolitan level. So this spatial scalar disjunct for regulation is a real challenge, I think, in thinking about in many of the ways. The rate cards are very much initiated by unions. The employers are absolutely not creating rate cards. I think all our experience of it has been that workers have led this. The other place where this formalization by task is coming is through new emergent recruitment channels through agencies. We found very little of this right now. The majority of the recruitment remains word of mouth referrals that are spatially structured to the neighborhood. In fact, many workers are actually tied to neighborhoods even more than residents and employers sometimes. Renters come and go and the same worker works in the same house or the same building or the same neighborhood for many years. So the rate cards seem to be a way in which organization is also trying to create a more local. I think the advantage of the rate card to me potentially is that it can fix wages at a neighborhood or deeply hyper-local scale and not rely on city-level regulation. That's its promise. And the last part of your question that I want to pick up is the role of the RWAs. When we presented this work in Bangalore, the unions locally said that they had just begun to sign their first tripartite agreements with workers, unions, and resident welfare associations, particularly of gated building communities. So this, I think, is also an emerging practice. It's a different kind of tripartite agreement. It's not state union worker in the classic formulation. It's RWA union worker, but it returns us to the hyper-local neighborhood scale, and B, it is the most proximate determinant of the conditions and quality of employment. So I think that these are new union practices that are responding to the particular nature of domestic work, its speciality and its sectoral forms. And they, RWAs are certainly, I think, a place where those not, and so what we're also saying is that it's not only where work conditions are being negotiated, but wages are being fixed exactly at that scale. So I think that's an important site for arena for future action. In fact, one of the discussions we had in the Bangalore launch of the report is what does it mean for unions to scale their activities at neighborhood level as opposed to city or state? And I think that's a very interesting debate that continues to move forward in this. Just to answer Francois' question on the determination of wages, so Francois, the way the thing is determined is that we looked at the median income per household and then used that for the multiplier to 8 and 12. The median time that is spent, because many workers are not paid by time but by task, so hours are not the basis of determination of wages in general. But one of the things that we were seeing basically was then to say, how many households would you have to work in for the median income in that quartile to make minimum wage? So it's a calculation not on hours, but on payment, on reported payment per worker. And I think the last point about non-wage benefits, including mediation, I don't think that's something we took in our frame when we went in. We were sticking quite closely to internationally comparable measures of decent work. But if someone in the team would like to say whether we came across incidents of mediation, Kashi, you wanted to add something?
Yes, so in our third report, you will find some instances, very few, where employers have said that this is something that they help with, but again, it's not seen as an employer responsibility And that's something that we need to underline here. So, and also that this is not a worker right. So it's seen as an altruistic thing that you do for your domestic worker, because domestic workers are perceived to come from low income backgrounds and other vulnerabilities. So it's something that they do. Very few employers said it, but they did say that, if there are challenges in their home, we do it, or we give them advice on how to raise their children or on health related things. But again, like, it's very important to kind of underline the fact that this is not seen as the right of the worker, but is also deeply subjective to each employer. So if an employer does it, they do it because it's their sort of, worldview. But again, we didn't see many mentions of this, but we did see some.
All right. Thank you for those responses. I think we have some more questions coming into our chat box. And I think Nalini wants to come in. Nalini, please accept the prompt when it upgrades you to panelist, so we can then be able to hear you. But in the meanwhile, let me read out Julie's question. She's congratulating you on your valuable research done. And then asks, do you have any knowledge of employers putting their computer, for example, available for domestic workers to use, or even teaching them how to do that? To use them for training or education after working hours, so that the workplace becomes a learning place also. And I'm just, again, wanting to sort of connect this to the question of skill, because it directly relates to wages, right? Because we don't really, I think, count experience in terms of calculating skill and wages of workers. And again, it'll be great to know if there were any reflections on, from the employers on skill in terms of experience. So that's that. I don't know if Nalini is here yet. Nalini, if you can put your mic on.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation. And actually, from looking at the employers, from the employer's point of view, it was very interesting. But working with domestic workers myself, I was just wondering, and when you speak about tripartism and the role of the state, that through this study, we haven't really been able to emphasize why it's important for the state to support social security for the domestic worker. And I'm saying this from the point of view of the fact that, you looked at household as just, your concept of household and care work was restricted to the service of caring and food preparation, things like this, which you called reproduction. But as a feminist, we look at home as production, because you're producing the generation, the next generation for labor in your society. And therefore, the state has a major role in supporting this kind of care, this kind of production in society. So by restricting the household with the concept that you present, I fear that you leave out this whole aspect of production of life, which is basically what this woman is concerned with and why she can't enter the labor force otherwise. And the rationale for us demanding the role of the state in social protection comes from this. So if you, and what we are demanding as unions in the comprehensive legislation for domestic workers that we demand is the creation of the tripartite board, where the state contributes either from house tax or wealth tax or whatever to the social security of the worker. I agree with all the other points you've made about wages and things like that. But this particular aspect has to come in because this is what the home is all about. This is what the production of life is all about, which is costing people, women's labor, which of course you don't calculate here. You calculate time, but there's a whole aspect of the production of life. So somehow I feel that something has been left out. And I would see, because And it's such studies are important, but we have to go deeper.
Nalini, no disagreements with any of what you said. I think that, in the report, we talk about all, multiple these forms of looking at the question of production, reproduction, and the feminist debates about the household. I think for us, I think that when we had this initial discussion with what we would make as our specific contribution, was simply to actually say that I think that work, yours and other work on the role of the state, I think has tread ground. We know a lot about in questions of the conventions, the boards. We were interested very specifically to say that even tomorrow, if we get the board, if we get the tripartite welfare board, its implementation will have to go through employers, because the employers are that space of workplace. So our interest was to come in. That's why we emphasize so much in the report 3, the importance of the delivery mechanism, showing that the employers distrust the state, that they worry about this intrusion. Because if you take the example of the other welfare boards, let's look at construction. Right? Let's look at the welfare boards we've seen in other sectors. We've precisely created boards that are unable to reach the full, even expend their full budgets, if you look at construction. So I think there is no question for us that a lot of the structure of care and the structure of social protection absolutely is a public state responsibility. Our role is very limited in this, which is to say domestic work will peculiarly require the employers to play along, or at least not actively sabotage these gained rights when they are set up by the state. And so we were trying to find and say, where are these employers now? And what would it take if, say, we pass 189 tomorrow, pass the comprehensive bill tomorrow, create a new domestic welfare board? What are the ways in which we're going to think about implementation and monitoring and grievance redressal and actual delivery? And are the employers going to resist this? Are they going to support it? What parts will they resist? What part will they support? So the focus of the employer is only to say that I think there is such a wealth of work in this space that we wanted to add to this one particular question. But everything you said, I agree.
And also, I think when we're talking about social protection, one of the things that we really wanted to look at is the range of responses. The fact that employers are not a homogeneous group of people, but within them also had from, completely saying no to completely saying yes, and in between hesitant, not sure how it will work. So there was a complete range. So when we actually think about social protection, I think for us as researchers, it's also important to think about all of these various groups of employers and how do we sort of take them along while moving towards social protection, which we absolutely want toward in the end. But what is that journey going to be like? And especially learning from other boards and, other sectors of work.
But thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Nalini. Thanks, Divya. And just to also, if I may add, I think the list of tasks that you referred to, it does include cleaning and a whole host of activities that are undertaken, right, at the household level.
Actually,
thanks,
in the report, if I may add, in the report, we do discuss these definitions and we pitch it in context with the sort of the history and the conversation around production and reproduction.
Exactly. And also just to say, I think, this is interesting to really then reflect upon, of course, we want, social protection from the state. But in the absence of it, what are the different forms of, social security responsibilities that employers can begin to take up, right? And can we actually take a leaf out of that? Because as was pointed out in the presentation as well, I think, and I'm sure Nalini agrees, right, to this, which is that there are so many variations in this country in terms of different states and different contexts that we are working in. Maybe a one-size-fits-all may not work, but I think at the state level to really take up the benefits or the protection of domestic workers is something that, while we demand for a central law, is also something that may not, should not lose focus. Thank you for that. I think there's a question by Randhir that I'd like to draw your attention to, and he's asking, I want to know a bit more on the caste-based discrimination. From your findings, is it more prominent in some cities, or was it uniform across different cities? Also, other than recruitment, was there any caste-based discrimination in domestic workers' day-to-day treatment at the household by the employer. And I think you did allude to some, but it'll be nice to have some more reflections. Over to you. Thanks.
So, Randhir, we can just draw upon the 4 studies that were both the 2016-17 ones by IHT, which looked at Delhi and Mumbai. And there you saw a reported finding, at least in recruitment. The employers said that they don't factor in caste. They don't consider it an important factor. In Chennai, we found the same. But like we reported in Bangalore, we found a strikingly different pattern. In terms of asking, how important caste was to employers when thinking about recruitment. So there does seem to be a sort of structural question in terms of this deeply personalized and localized neighborhood recruitment market. And I think that right now what we have in these 4 is basically 3 cities taking one pattern and Bangalore being an exception. I'm not sure quite what to make of that, but you see that difference. I think the other thing I will say is that, one of the ways that if one keeps looking into this, some of the new work, say, by researchers at IIM Bangalore, Deepak Malgan, Andali Rahman, that have shown the kind of caste-based neighborhood spatial segregation in Indian housing markets means that a lot of our spatial sampling method is actually also a geography of caste, and that's, I think, something that we're trying to mine as a separate angle with this data, which means that if the neighborhood recruitment pattern is deeply spatialized at neighborhood level, and the neighborhoods itself is an outcome of caste-based separation, that there's going to be overlaps between that kind of labor mobility. And I think certainly we're seeing it structurally. And I think, Divya can say more about the way in which the everyday and the language in which people talk about caste in the qualitative interviews, because I think it's very different to sort of answer a Likert survey question, but then also have to talk about it in in-depth interviews. So Divya, if you want to pick up from them.
Yeah, I think we have several examples in the report where employers at first said they did not think about caste or religion, but then when they went into talking about what kind of a worker they were looking for, they would have descriptions of how, they hired a particular worker because from a particular religion because she understood the requirements of the house because they belonged to the same religion. Or in some cases, they said particularly, for example, that they wouldn't hire Christian and Muslim workers, would only hire Hindu workers, but also referring to the fact that Hindu workers were more likely to, for example, clean the toilets, which Christian and Muslim workers don't. So, and in that is implicit the conversation around caste, right? Who within these workers is willing to do certain kinds of tasks versus some other kinds of tasks. But what we also found is that because there is this neighborhood effect, who gets to do what kind of work then also gets sort of settled in some sense. Certain workers are like for cooking, it's a different workforce. Cleaning is a different workforce. So we saw that quite a bit in even the region mattered, the language mattered in some cases, caste, age, as we said. Age was something that we were not expecting to that extent, but it was really interesting to see, as I said, they don't want workers that are too old, but don't want workers that are too young and have babies. So what does it mean in terms of social protection, right? If the the work cycle of the worker ends by, say, 45, 50, what happens to the rest of her age in terms of her ability to find work in the labor force? So yeah, it was a fairly, it's quite, we've described it quite in detail in the report.
And, just to also share, I think this is in discussion with Rashi when we met in Bangalore as well. I think it would be also interesting to factor in, the context. I mean, the fact that there has been a very active social justice movement, right, in Chennai might make employers more woke in terms of articulating caste as a factor. So I think it's really interesting to see what these surveys bring out and the real need for complementary approaches where we combine quantitative and qualitative methods to really understand the broad picture. No, thank you very much for that.
Sorry, Neha, I wanted to say we didn't answer Julie's question in the chat about we did not come across any such example. I think it goes back again to the particular urban nature of live out part-time work. And I think if anything, you would think about this question of skilling or a computer asset, it would be directed towards the children of domestic workers. And like we said, there is among employers a large amount of self-perceived responsibility for the education of children, which is really part of also a deeply kind of, this goes back to that notion of care, control, and rights, right? Because it's a deeply moral economy of a sense of legitimate versus illegitimate aspirations. Children's education is seen as morally clear. There is a way in which it separates itself from, say, the aspiration of domestic worker to a reasonable wage or to paid time off or to maternity support. So it's, I think one of the things that we also wanted to begin to distinguish is to see practices that already exist. For example, so much of the delivery of, say, new legislation on universal health insurance for informal workers. But the practice that a lot of employers are already doing is to cover the costs of actually occurring treatment, which both allows domestic workers reported to choose different kinds of healthcare providers. You may go to a private provider instead of a public provider. You may go to a preferred provider in your neighborhood. And lots of employers reporting, the fact that they were willing to pay for medical expenses and support sick leave. Very, very different from maternity, where dismissal was the first discussion. So I think these distinctions matter in the detail of the delivery of social protection in actual practice. This is where the translation of rights into substantive entitlements is playing out. And so if employers are already willing to pay, then should the design of health access or social protection for domestic workers not necessarily assume that insurance is the best way to do it, but actually think of these practices of pre-operative and pre-treatment and post-treatment direct compensation, which employers seem to be willing to do. So here again, the question of thinking about structures of how the state, once it passes regulation that says, look, this has to happen, then begins to work with employers on ways of making it happen. And again, it goes back to the point we were saying to Nalini about the reason to think about employers not in any way as compensation or substituting for state role, but as the sites and actors that will have to be part of the governance and implementation of whatever state regulation and rights we win, which we must. So I think that's the way we can think about that. And I think Igor's message in the chat is sort of signaling the end of both power and structure in our time.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. And that's true. Igor might fall off the call because of the power issue. But I think
Thank you to everyone. Thanks. I'm sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. But I think this has been really great timing. I know the survey and the fieldwork took longer than we expected, but I think with the presentation and the quality of the reports, we're real bang on. So thank you so much, everyone. I don't know if Rashi or Antara have anything to add at this point. No, so.
Just we'd be happy to continue having these conversations, and please do go through the reports and reach out to us at IHS, and we'd be happy to engage.
Absolutely. And I think we will be sharing the links again of the reports as well as a link to the recording that will be made publicly available. And I would invite all of you to please go through these reports and do write back to us if you have any thoughts or comments. Let me also take this opportunity to thank then Dagmar for taking out her precious time, and she's always been a pillar of support for the work that we've done. And I think this study has really been a corner point in terms of our work, trying to push forward the agenda in terms of course, promoting decent work, but also understanding the dynamics of paid and unpaid domestic work, which then influence what the contours of the decent work agenda, how they shape out in the case of domestic workers. Dagmar, would you like to say anything in the end?
Thank you so much. No, I really was impressed by the details and really all the dimensions that came out from this survey and the reports, and really this combination, as you already mentioned, of qualitative and quantitative research. And I really look forward to, it actually triggers a lot of food for thought rather. And I'm really interested to see how it will further nurture the debate and also further studies, but also concrete action on the ground. And really enjoyed hearing this example of trade unions having made, or there is kind of some innovative agreements that are being negotiated or brokered and agreed on. So Yeah, I think it's a really important piece as we go forward. Thank you very much, everyone, and also for the contributions from the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Dagmar. And I join you in thanking all the participants for taking the time to be here. And we look forward to a continued engagement on some of these issues that have been flagged here. I'd also like to thank once again the fantastic research team that has put together these reports. And I hope we can collaborate to take some of the takeaways from these studies, and try and work on policy advocacy along these lines. I'd also very much like to thank Yogendra, my colleague from the Delhi office, for his IT support, without which we all couldn't have congregated today for this discussion. And he has now appeared from being invisible to visible for a bit. So there he was. I'm also grateful to Binod, who's really been behind the design of the poster and helps us with all the contracts and the logistics to a very large extent. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. Have a very good evening, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar that we have to discuss the decent work agenda. Thank you and good night.
Good night.